Okay, so we should start at the beginning. The first people to occupy North America probably came across the Bering Strait, where there was once a land bridge between Asia and North America, about 25,000 years ago. And they were hunter-gatherers following their prey into what is now Canada, and then down into what is the United States, and then, of course, Mesoamerica and South America. By about 8,000 BCE, they had established a climate. Uh, the climate had stabilized to a climate that is similar to ours today as they emerged from the last ice age. And in particular, the first cities in North America, where the United States is today, started being established during the Archaic stage of Native American development among tribes known as the Mound Builders. And I'm going to show you an example of those mounds here in just a moment. You can see here an example of the first North American city, Cahokia, Illinois, which is just across the Mississippi River from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. You can go there today, and of course, this mound building culture built a huge city that thrived between 1050 and 1350 CE. And you can see the Mississippi in the background in a modern picture. And on the right is an artist's depiction of what the city would have looked like. People would have come here from all over the Mississippi Valley in order to trade. When we speak of indigenous cultures, probably the most important hallmark to occur in the development of indigenous cultures prior to European contact was the agricultural revolution, in which indigenous tribes began to farm as opposed to simply practice hunting and gathering. And that agricultural revolution took place between 3400 BCE all the way through 800 CE. And when we speak about indigenous cultures in North America, what is now the United States, as well as Mesoamerica, which is Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different tribes and cultures. The most advanced of these cultures were the Mayans, who actually pioneered the mathematical concept of zero, which is a very important concept. The Incas, who occupied the west coast of what is now South America and Peru. And of course, the Aztecs. And the Spanish, of course, encountered the Aztecs. We'll talk about that. And the Aztecs had recently, within the last couple of hundred years, conquered the valley of what is now central Mexico, when the Spanish first encountered them. On the east coast of the United States, you have what are known as the Eastern woodland cultures. We're going to be talking about these cultures more in depth as we talk about European contact with them. But these Eastern woodland cultures, some of them were mound builders, some of them were farmers, but they practiced a mixture of farming and animal husbandry. And you can see on the right a map of different cultural groups that occupied different parts of what is now the United States. I think that sometimes we have this perception that Europeans first brought civilization to indigenous peoples, but that is not true. In fact, especially when you talk about the civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America, these indigenous cultures were far more advanced technologically, mathematically than the Europeans who encountered them. The Europeans, though, had certain advantages, among them firearms and disease. And firearms and the diseases that Europeans brought with them are the main weapons that they used intentionally and unintentionally to conquer these indigenous cultures. This is a map of Native American tribes across what is now the United States, and you can see the sheer diversity and, of course, the dense population that actually existed here long prior to European contact. We call this the pre-Columbian period because it was before European contact, before the voyages of Christopher Columbus, hence pre-Columbian. What motivated Europeans to begin looking outward from their continent? Well, this era is called the Age of Exploration. It took place as Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, and it took place in the wake of the Crusades. The Crusades, which of course took place between 1095 and 1291 CE, were a series of bloody campaigns by Western European Christian monarchs to try to conquer the Holy Land and take it from Muslims. These crusades, of course, led the Europeans into contact with those in South Asia and East Asia and India and China, and the Europeans discovered that they could trade with these other civilizations, these other peoples, things like silk, jewels, and they developed what was known as the Silk Road, which ran from the Holy Land, from Palestine, down through the subcontinent of India and all the way over to China. But the problem is that as the Crusades came to an end, it became more and more difficult to trade with these other areas, not the least of which because of the rise of the Ottoman Turks, who began to conquer large parts of the Middle East. Of course, the Ottoman Empire would last from the 1400s until the end of World War I in 1919. And so Europeans began looking at possible water routes to trade with Asia. And to that end, the Portuguese were the first to begin developing caravels, small sailing ships that could navigate the waters off of the coast of North Africa. And the Portuguese also invented the magnetic compass to help guide them in their travels. And of course, we're going to see how the initial Portuguese explorations down the coast of West Africa affected the this age of exploration, or kicked off this age of exploration. We often hear the term New World applied to the Americas, but was it really new? Indigenous cultures already lived there. Certainly it wasn't new to them, but in some ways it became new as European contact changed the landscape of the Americas. First, you had land use. Uh, Native Americans tended to build villages where clearings already existed in the forest, whereas Europeans tended to clear cut forests in order to build their towns and villages. And you also had differences over the conceptions of private property, whereas Europeans were accustomed to the type of private property laws we have today, strict lines drawn on maps. Native Americans tended to hold property in common within the tribes, particularly the tribes of North America. They took from the land what they needed and left the rest. Of course, there were some Native American civilizations that had stricter constructions of private property, but in general, this became a problem. And often, European contact with Native Americans devolved into a destructive cycle of disease and dependency as Europeans brought diseases with them, and Native Americans became dependent on European trade goods, like consumers throughout history. And the European clear cutting of forests also had another unintended consequence, and that was early climate change. As the Europeans deforested large parts of the eastern seaboard in what is now North America, they actually raised the climate. They raised the temperature of North America. So climate change today, of course, is an existential threat to everything, to humanity. But even at this time, you had some early version of climate change as deforestation occurred. When we talk about the exchange between Europeans and Native Americans in this European age of exploration, one of the things we should talk about are all of the various plants, animals, and diseases that were introduced for the first time, either to the Americas and the Western Hemisphere, or vice versa to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so some of the things that were first introduced to Europe that were only available or indigenous to the Western Hemisphere included pumpkins, squash, peppers, tobacco, turkeys, pineapple, cocoa, beans, vanilla, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts. Meanwhile, the things coming the other way, being introduced to the Western Hemisphere and to the indigenous peoples there for the first time, included diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. Animals like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, grains like wheat, rice, barley, and oats, foods like peaches, pears, coffee beans, turnips, olives, citrus fruits, grapes, bananas, sugarcane, and honeybees. And so just imagine Native Americans for the first time encountering things like smallpox and the flu. Hey, thanks, guys. And of course, Europeans encountering things like tomatoes and potatoes. That's right. Before the Columbian Exchange, there were no tomatoes in Italian food. And before the Columbian Exchange, there were no potatoes in Ireland. Just to give you a few examples, before the Columbian Exchange, there were no cattle, sheep, pigs, or horses in Texas, and the list goes on and on. So, fascinating exchange of diseases, plants, and animals in this time period. Of course, as the Portuguese ventured down the west coast of Africa seeking a water route to Asia, they encountered the peoples of West Africa. And at that time, the peoples of West Africa consisted of no fewer than 45 different empires, civilizations, and cultures. And some of them quite advanced, like the indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica or South America. And in 1444, the first Portuguese slave ship returned from West Africa with enslaved Africans to Portugal. And for the next over 400 years, until 1888, the transatlantic slave trade continued. And this transatlantic slave trade ended up enslaving 25 million people. Of the 25 million people, 10% died at the coast or before reaching the coast. At the coast, they would be housed in barracoons like the one you see here. In these long wooden or stone shelters called barracoons. So 10% died that way. 40% died on the voyage across the Atlantic in what was known as the Middle Passage. And of course, the other 50% lived to become enslaved in the Americas. Now, slavery, of course, existed in West Africa prior to European contact, but slavery in West Africa was very different from the slavery that developed in the Western Hemisphere. In West Africa, you could be enslaved for debt, If you gave birth to the child of a freedman, you would become free. So there were a variety of ways in and out of slavery, and there was never any permanent underclass of enslaved people. The way that slavery in the Western Hemisphere came to differ from slavery in West Africa, the reason that Thomas Jefferson called it the peculiar institution, is that slavery in the Western Hemisphere came to be defined by the 1660s by three distinct characteristics. The first was the race characteristic, that is, you were enslaved based on the color of your skin. The second was the matrilineal characteristic, that is, you were enslaved based on the status of your mother. If your mother was enslaved, you would be enslaved. And finally, there was the property principle, in which you were a chattel. And a chattel in English, under English common law, is a personal, movable piece of property with no rights of its own. So these three characteristics, the race characteristic, the matrilineal characteristic, and the chattel principle, came to define slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and it was very different, substantially worse than slavery that existed in West Africa prior to European contact. On the left, you can see an artist's depiction of the interior of a slave ship. Enslaved Africans packed in as many as they could pack in. They knew, the enslavers knew, that many would die before they reached the Western Hemisphere. And so they tried to make up for that by packing as many people in as they could. People died of uh, dysentery, they died of scurvy, they died of a variety of causes. On the right, you can see what is called the door of no return. This is the door of no return in Elmina Castle in what is now Ghana. It was constructed by the Portuguese in 1482 and served as a holding place for enslaved Africans before they embarked onto slave ships. And it was called the door of no return because once you passed through that door, that was the last you would ever see of your homeland, your family, or anything else before being sold onto a slaving ship and shipped to the Western Hemisphere. This is a picture today of Elmina Castle in what is now Ghana. You can still go there and visit it today. And there is also a map of the transatlantic slave trade. Of course, the larger the arrows indicate the larger number of enslaved Africans taken to that location out of West Africa. One of the other motivators of European exploration was European political consolidations. As Europe began to emerge from the Middle Ages, these political consolidations at home then led to more exploration beyond their borders. So the Portuguese, the Spanish, busy trying to find a water route to Asia. Meanwhile, the political consolidation that took place on the Iberian Peninsula was known as the Reconquista. It was an 800-year offshoot of the Crusades in which the Christians on the Iberian Peninsula attempted to rid the peninsula of the Muslims, the Moors, who were an Islamic people that had moved north into the Iberian Peninsula. And this Reconquista, or Reconquest, again lasted for 800 years. But in 1469, the Reconquista got a major shot in the arm with the marriage of King Ferdinand of Castile and Queen Isabella of Aragon. And with the unification of these two Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, They redoubled their efforts to conquer the last Muslim kingdom of Granada on the southern coast. Finally, in January of 1492, Granada surrendered. The Reconquista, though, did continue in some ways. One of the consequences of the Reconquista was the Spanish Inquisition, in which the Grand Inquisitor would torture Muslims and Jews who lived on the Iberian Peninsula until they either converted to Christianity and recited the requerimiento, or requirement for salvation, or died. And so the Spanish Inquisition continued. You can see here an 1880s painting of the surrender of the King of Granada. And of course, you can see a map here of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and Portugal, which were all Christian kingdoms. And of course, Granada in the south, that was an Islamic kingdom. Enter Christopher Columbus. Born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy, as a young man, he ventured west and became involved in as a pilot in Spanish slaving ventures down the west coast of Africa. And Columbus came to believe that by sailing straight west, you could reach the Indies. It is a myth that anyone at the time, any educated person at the time of Columbus, believed the world to be flat. They did not. They knew it to be round. Even the ancient Greeks had known it to be round. But Columbus underestimated the circumference of the earth. And in his estimation, there would not have been room for any uh, continents of North or South America. And so he was convinced that by sailing west, you could reach the subcontinent of India, you could reach China, you could reach a water route with Asia. In 1484, he approached the King of Portugal with his plan. The King of Portugal, though, had already invested in another explorer named Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama, of course, did sail around the Horn of Africa and reach India and returned in 1498. But meanwhile, Columbus went on to approach Ferdinand and Isabella. And finally, in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella outfitted Columbus with three caravels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And of course, Columbus and his men set sail. They resupplied at the Canary Islands. The Canary Islanders, of course, were the first victims of Spanish colonization, and a disturbing pattern emerged in which the Spanish wiped out most of the Canary Islanders and enslaved the rest. Sadly, it was a fate that also awaited indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica. In October of 1492, of course, Columbus and his men sighted land, and Columbus, mistakenly believing they had reached the outer islands and the outer coast of India, referred to the natives as Los Indios, as the Indians. But remember that Columbus and his men are conquistadors. They're not only soldiers of the king, but they're soldiers of God. And so, from the very beginning, the Spanish began visiting atrocities upon the indigenous tribes. Uh, and within just a few short years, had wiped out many of the tribes that occupied the Caribbean before their arrival. In fact, in the first century of contact with the Spanish, between disease and genocide, 98% of the natives of Mesoamerican were wiped off the face of the earth in the first century of contact with the Spanish. Columbus himself, of course, enslaved some natives and brought them back with him to Ferdinand and Isabella. He made three more voyages to uh, north to the Caribbean, never realizing that it was, that there was a North American continent. He had sighted the coast of Mexico, but never actually landed on the mainland. Columbus was actually appointed the first governor of the Indies and was imprisoned in 1499 for atrocities against the natives. So he was accused of atrocities and imprisoned for them even during his own lifetime. And so this is why you'll often see protests against Columbus Day in the United States, and many localities in the United States changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day because of the murderous record of Christopher Columbus and his brothers who helped him govern or misgovern uh, Los Indios. Now, within just a few years after Columbus's voyage, the Spanish had colonized the Caribbean. They enslaved the natives to work on sugar plantations that they developed. And of course, as the natives died or escaped, they replaced them with enslaved Africans. And so this is how the transatlantic African slave trade really gets a start in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, let's talk about the conquest of Mexico. Hernan Cortez was a minor government functionary on the island of Cuba. And Cortez began hearing rumors of vast wealth to the mainland to the west, what is now Mexico, and he approached Governor Vasquez of Cuba about launching an expedition. Vasquez initially granted him permission to launch an expedition, but as Cortez was preparing to sail, Vasquez changed his mind. Cortez sailed before the courier reached him, so he could plausibly say he didn't know of the governor's wishes. Cortez and his men, the conquistadors, landed at what is now Veracruz. In fact, Cortez established the village of Veracruz in July of 1519. The first native tribe they encountered were the Tlaxcalans. And the Tlaxcalans were the last tribe in central Mexico that had not been conquered by the Aztecs. And as such, they were more than happy to point Cortez's way toward Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. Now, the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica people. Mexica, Mexica. That's where we get the term Mexico from, the Mexica people. Cortez and his men reached Tenochtitlan in November of 1519. The ruler of the Aztecs was Emperor Montezuma II. And there were some Aztec accounts, some Mexica accounts, that perhaps Montezuma believed that Cortez was an Aztec god by the name of Quetzalcoatl come back in human form, but this is almost certainly apocryphal, as the account was written down after the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. Meanwhile, Governor Vasquez has sent Panfilo de Narvaez after Cortez. In April of 1520, Narvaez and his men landed at Veracruz. Cortez rushed back to the coast with some of his men, and they fought Narvaez in a pitched battle there. Cortez and his men beat Narvaez in this battle. And one of Cortez's men actually gouged out Narvaez's left eye with a spear. Narvaez became known as the One-Eyed Conquistador after that. And they actually brought some prisoners of the Narvaez expedition back with them to Tenochtitlan. Of course, unfortunately, one of Narvaez's men had the measles and spread the measles among the Mexica population. Meanwhile, the descriptions that the Spanish left of Tenochtitlan describe an incredible city of maybe 250,000 people. They had running water that they piped in from the mainland. They took hot baths daily. They had a beautiful hanging gardens in the center of the city, along with the main temple. At the main temple, of course, the Aztecs did practice human sacrifice. But the city was actually divided up by professions. You lived amongst into neighborhoods, into a business district. They had garbage collection, organized sports with ball courts and uh, bleachers carved out of stone from which to watch the sports. Really a very advanced culture, far beyond anything the Spanish had ever experienced. After all, the largest city any of the Spanish had ever seen was Lisbon, with maybe 20,000 people. Furthermore, the Spanish also introduced horses to the Mexica. The Aztecs had never seen horses. So when they saw Cortez from a long way off, they initially thought it was some sort of half man, half horse. But only upon getting closer did they realize it was a man mounted on a horse. Of course, the Cortez and the conquistadors did not bathe regularly at all, so I'm sure the first thought of the Mexica was, what is that smell? But anyway, so Cortez defeats Narvaez and returns to Tenochtitlan. Meanwhile, the Aztecs were preparing for their annual festivals, and Pedro de Alvarado, one of Cortez's lieutenants, mistook their festival preparations for war preparations. And Alvarado and his men waded into the crowd of warriors and killed several hundred Mexica warriors. Well, that was the end of the honeymoon period between the Spanish and the Mexica. And so Cortez and his men were held up in the royal palace. They murdered Emperor Montezuma. And then was known as La Noche Triste, June 30th to July 1st, 1520. The Spanish cut their way out of the capital Tenochtitlan along the causeways leading out of the city. They returned then to lay siege to the city. And finally, on August 13th, 1521, they conquered Tenochtitlan, and this is the conquest of Mexico. The lake, the shallow lake that surrounded the island city of Tenochtitlan, all of that area today is Mexico City. The lake dried up in the 19th century, and all of that is Mexico City today. So, but this is how Hernan Cortez conquered the Mexica, the Aztecs. The colony of New Spain, as what is now Mexico was designated, developed along the lines of the encomienda system. The encomienda system, which was first pioneered by Christopher Columbus, resembled the European feudal system in which the natives served an encomendero, or large landholder. Cortez himself, of course, became the wealthiest encomendero in New Spain. And of course, the colony revolved around Roman Catholicism, Christianity, the religion of the Catholics. And of course, the priests encouraged intermarriage between the Spaniards and native women. And you can see here a a priest baptizing a woman into the church. And on the right, you can see the Spanish, who finally found the gold they'd been looking for. The Aztecs collected gold. They called it the tears of the sun. And so all the Aztec gold, of course. And this is the beginning of the colony of New Spain. The second European power to begin founding colonies in what would become the United States were the French. And French explorations of North America began with an attempt to find the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage, of course, was a fabled waterway, supposed waterway, that ran all the way through the North American continent and connected the Atlantic with the Pacific. Of course, we know today there is no such waterway. But even as late as 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition, one of the things they were searching for is the Northwest Passage. So you had the French explorer Jacques Cartier, who entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534, and then the colony of New France, what is now eastern Canada, Quebec, was claimed for France by Samuel de Champlain in 1608, and colonial development began from there. It was Pierre Jacques Marquette who traveled down the Mississippi River. The French found the headwaters of the Mississippi in what is now Minnesota, and Marquette traveled down the Mississippi in 1673. But it was Sieur de La Salle, Rene Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, who traveled all the way down the Mississippi and out into the Gulf of Mexico and claimed all of the land drained by the Mississippi for the King of France, and of course, diplomatically named the whole region Louisiana in honor of King Louis of France. Of course, La Salle, after his expedition in 1682, would launch another expedition to found a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. He would overshoot his destination, end up shipwrecked in what is now Matagorda Bay, Texas, and then end up murdered in the woods of East Texas by his own men. If you have any curiosity, I would encourage you to look up La Salle's Texas expedition, where he overshot the mouth of the Mississippi by 400 miles and ultimately ended up murdered in the piney woods of East Texas. But this is how the French began founding their colonies, first in what is now Quebec, and then, of course, the entire Louisiana region and areas along the Gulf Coast. They began founding colonies at places like Biloxi, Mobile, and New Orleans. The third and final of the major European powers to found colonies in what would become the United States were the English. And the English were late to the game because of the political and religious turmoil accompanied by the reign of King Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII was the second of the Tudor monarchs to rule England, the House of Tudor. The first was his father, King Henry VII, who had defeated King Richard III in battle. Henry VIII became king upon his father's death in 1509, and when he became king, he married Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon had been his brother's wife, but his brother had died, and in order to maintain a political alliance between England and Spain, Henry married Catherine. Henry VIII, though, was a womanizer and had become obsessed with the idea of producing a male heir to succeed him. He did not believe that a woman could rule England effectively. And he and Catherine had a daughter together, but no son. And so Henry petitioned the Pope, Pope Clement VII, for an annulment. Now, an annulment in the Catholic Church at that time meant that you had never consummated the marriage, yet they had a child together. How would Henry explain this? Henry claimed, rather inventively, that because Catherine had been his brother's wife before him, she was not a virgin at the time of their marriage, and therefore their marriage was invalid. Now, the Pope might have bought this argument and granted an annulment, but he was under pressure from Ferdinand and Isabella not to grant the annulment, and so Catherine remained the Queen of England. Meanwhile, Henry VIII started paying attention to developments in mainland Europe surrounding reforms to the Christian church. Up until this time, the only Christian church was the Catholic Church. But according to legend, on October 31st, 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses or 95 points of protest against the Catholic Church to the door of the cathedral in the German town where he lived. Almost certainly the story did not happen the way it's come down, but October 31st has become known as Reformation Day. Martin Luther had come to believe that the Catholic Church was decadent, corrupt, and was not following the teachings of the Bible. And so he protested the Catholic Church by drawing up these 95 points of protest. At the root, Protestant means Protestant, or protesting the Catholic Church. And the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation are more complex than that. Nevertheless, reform movements against the Catholic Church rose up among Christian circles in Europe. This is known as the Protestant Reformation, and to this day, broadly speaking, there are two main types of Christians: Protestants and Catholics. If you're not Catholic, you are Protestant by definition. And of course, the Protestants have divided into a number of different churches: the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, but they're all Protestant. Meanwhile, Henry VIII had been having an affair with a woman named Anne Boleyn. Oh, the reason that Henry VIII wanted to Henry VIII wanted to form a separate church, a Church of England, the Anglican Church. And he wanted to do this because in the Protestant Church, divorce was permitted, whereas it was not in the Catholic Church. And as the head of the new Church of England, Henry could grant himself a divorce. Well, he had been having an affair with Anne Boleyn. And in 1527, Henry VIII began forming the Church of England. By 1533, he felt he was on firm enough ground, and he granted himself a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. Once again, like Catherine before her, Anne Boleyn could not produce a male heir. They had a daughter, but no son. By 1536, Henry has already moved on to a woman named Jane Seymour, with whom he's having an affair. Anne Boleyn is getting desperate, and in 1536, Henry VIII has charges brought against Anne Boleyn, charges of adultery against the king, and incest. Henry charged that Anne had been having an affair with her own brother to produce a son and allow Henry to think the heir was his. There's no basis for these allegations in fact that anyone has ever turned up, and yet Anne Boleyn was beheaded, executed for these charges in 1536. And finally, in 1536, after divorcing Catherine and having Anne beheaded, the Catholic Church permanently broke with Henry, and the Church of England became independent. Henry VIII, of course, married Jane Seymour in 1536, and the next year, Jane Seymour died in childbirth with a son, Edward. And finally, Henry VIII had his male heir. Became King Edward VI. Over the last 10 years of his life, Henry VIII, first of all, suffered a serious hunting accident that over the last 10 years of his life limited his mobility, caused him to put on weight. The painting of him you see here on the left is of him when he is older. And the wound never completely healed properly and ultimately killed him by 1547. Meanwhile, in the last 10 years of his life, Henry VIII also had 3 more wives, bringing the total to 6. The 6 wives of Henry VIII. There is an urban legend that Henry VIII had all of his 6 wives beheaded, but that is not true. He only had 2 of his 6 wives beheaded. The child pictured on the previous slide, of course, was King Edward VI, who became king at the tender age of 10 in 1547 at his father's death. Edward VI was never an entirely healthy child. The son of Jane Seymour, he only reigned for 6 years before dying in 1553. At that point, his older half-sister Mary became Queen Mary I. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the eldest of Henry's children. And Mary desired to make England a Catholic country again. And so during her reign, Mary the First specialized in persecuting, prosecuting, and executing Protestants in England. She became known to the Protestants as Bloody Mary, and the Marian martyrs, as they were known, are some of Europe's oldest Christian martyrs, and caused a lot of Protestants to flee England. But fortunately for the Protestants, Mary's reign was brief, 5 years. She died in 1558, and at that point, her younger half sister, Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Elizabeth I defied all of her father's expectations of women. She was a devout Protestant like her mother and ruled England extremely well and with an iron fist for the next 45 years until her death in 1603. Under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, first of all, Elizabeth never married and never had children, which led to her title as the Virgin Queen. Of course, she had male consorts throughout her life. She was not literally a virgin, but that was her reputation among the people of England. And she, under the reign of Elizabeth, England gained its national identity as a Protestant country. Elizabeth also served as the patron of Shakespeare. This is when Shakespeare is producing all of his plays. Elizabeth I also led England through difficult times. She helped defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. And of course, under Queen Elizabeth I, she continued her father's colonization of Ireland, and she also launched the first English colonization efforts in North America. The first English colonization efforts in North America began with Sir Walter Raleigh. He's a captain in the English Navy and one of Queen Elizabeth's consorts. And he approached the Queen in 1584 about settling a colony in North America. She agreed and outfitted him, backed his expedition. Raleigh and his men set sail and in 1584 landed in what is now the Outer Banks of North Carolina on Roanoke Island. And they settled a colony there. Raleigh, meanwhile, went back to England to gather supplies. And in his absence, the colonists abandoned the colony, felt it was a poor location. Well, in 1587, Raleigh tried again at the same spot to found a Roanoke colony. And then he returned to England to help defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. By the time that Raleigh returned to the colony site in 1590, the colonists were gone, and they only found one cryptic word carved into a tree at the colony site, Croatan. Now, ever since then, it has become known as the lost colony of Roanoke, but the idea that it's lost is a bit of a myth. Uh, Archaeological excavations have revealed that most likely what happened is that the English colonists joined the Croatan tribe on a nearby island there in order to survive. So the survivors joined local Native American tribes to survive. But because there's been no official explanation, it has become known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. After that, Raleigh lost interest in colonizing North America, and the English colonization effort almost died with the Roanoke colony. Sir Walter Raleigh, of course, named the entire region where he landed Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, his patron. Meanwhile, back in London, a writer named Richard Hakluyt published a book called The Principal Navigations, Voyages and Discoveries of the English Nation in 1589, using as many eyewitness accounts of North America as he could Hakluyt painted a glowing picture of the possibilities of North America, a land of milk and honey, as it were. And this book became a bestseller in London and kept interest in colonizing the New World alive. In fact, the Hakluyt Society would be the society that finally got permission from King James I in 1606 to settle a colony in North America that would become the Jamestown colony. That is for the next lecture. So this is the end of lecture 1.